She was 22 years old and homeless, standing at the edge of a road with the deed to her father's homestead folded in her coat pocket and a sheriff's boot print pressed into the soft mud of what used to be her front step. No family left to write to, no money to hire a lawyer who would take the case, no plan beyond the next mile, just a small tin sewing box that had belonged to her mother, and $11.40 in mixed coin. And with that, $11.40, Mary Ward walked out of Dry Creek in the last week of September and into the high country above the settled valley, where the pines closed over the trail and the maps went blank and the sheriff's authority thinned the way wood smoke thins in wind. She was walking toward a place she had seen only once before, years earlier, when she was a girl following an old woman up a game trail to gather medicine roots. And she was going there because it was the only ground in 100 miles that nobody official knew she remembered. But what nobody in Dry Creek knew, and what Mary Ward herself did not yet know, was that the tumbled-down cabin, waiting at the end of that trail, was hiding something under its floor that would outlast the sheriff and every man who signed his papers. If you like stories about quiet women who refuse to be erased, settle in and stay close, and let us know down in the comments where in the world you are watching from tonight. Mary Ward had been born on the homestead her father Elgin Ward filed in the second spring of the valley's settlement. 160 acres of good bottom grass along a bend of Dry Creek, where the water ran clear, even in August, and the cottonwoods gave shade to a small cabin, with a shake roof and a stone chimney her father had built himself with rock hauled up out of the creek bed. Her mother Hannah had died of a fever the winter Mary was 7. And after that, it was just the two of them, Elgin and the girl, running 40 head of cattle, and a milk cow, and a garden that fed them through most winters, with kraut and dried squash, and beans hung in cloth sacks from the rafters. Elgin taught her to shoot a rifle when she was 9, and to shoe a horse when she was 12, and to keep a running ledger of every dollar in and every dollar out when she was 14, because he said, a woman who could not count her own money would spend her life letting other people count it for her. But the person who shaped Mary Ward most was not her father. It was a widow named Ruth Ainsley, who lived alone in a cabin farther up the creek, and who took the motherless girl on long walks into the timber to teach her the names of plants and the reading of weather and the way an animal moves when it is hurt versus when it is only tired. Ruth Ainsley had been a midwife, and before that, a trapper's daughter, and she knew the high country the way most people knew their own kitchens, and she once took Mary, at 14, up a switchback trail to a hidden bench of meadow with a fallen cabin on it, and said quietly, "This was a man's place once. Remember it. Ground like this does not come to a person twice." When Ruth died in her sleep the following winter, she left Mary the tin sewing box she had carried since she was a girl herself, a small dented rectangle with pale blue enamel and a hinge repaired with copper wire, and inside it a needle case, a folding pair of scissors, 3 spools of thread, and a pressed sprig of yarrow that Ruth had picked the summer before. Mary carried that tin box everywhere after that, and when her father died 3 years later of a wagon accident on the freighting road, and the notes he had signed for cattle feed came due, and the sheriff of Dry Creek began coming around with papers and a soft, slow voice, the tin box was the thing she always put her hand on before she answered him. The sheriff's name was Ephraim Boone, and he was a large man in a clean coat who wore his badge on the outside of his vest so a person could not forget it was there. He came the first time in July with a paper he called a courtesy notice, and he came the second time in August with a paper he called a demand, and he came the third time in the last week of September with a paper he called a judgment and 2 men on horseback behind him who did not dismount. Mary Ward stood in the doorway of the cabin her father had built, and she read the judgment carefully. All the way through, the way Elgin Ward had taught her to read a ledger, and she saw that the amount owed on the feed notes had grown by fees and interest and a filing charge and a service charge until it was larger than the appraised value of the homestead, and she saw that the appraisal had been signed by a man in town who had never once walked the bottom land along the creek. She looked up at Sheriff Boone, and she asked him quietly whether the appraisal had been made in person, and he said it had been made according to the customary practice of the county, and she asked him what that meant, and he smiled without warmth and said it meant the matter was settled. He gave her until sundown to remove her personal effects. He said the cattle and the milk cow and the wagon and the standing corn were now the property of the county, pending sale, and he said the cabin would be padlocked at dusk. He said all of this in the soft, slow voice he used for widows and orphans, and anyone who could not fight him, and then he touched the brim of his hat and stepped down off the porch and put a boot print in the soft mud of the front step, because it had rained the night before. Mary Ward did not argue. She did not follow him to the horses. She went back inside, and she took down the tin sewing box from the shelf above the stove, and she set it on the table, and then she moved through the 2 rooms of the cabin, with a kind of steady attention, choosing. She took a wool blanket her mother had woven, and a second one her father had traded a calf for. She took a small hatchet, a skinning knife, a whetstone, a tin cup, a coffee pot, a cast-iron skillet, the size of a dinner plate, and a bag of cornmeal. She took the .44 rifle from over the door, and a box and a half of cartridges. She took a coil of rope, a candle stub, a flint striker, and the folded deed from the drawer of the writing desk, because the deed was hers, no matter what any paper in town said. She counted the coin in the household jar, and it came to $11.40 in mixed silver and copper, and she tied it into a square of muslin and put it in the pocket of her coat, with the deed and the tin box. Then she saddled the sorrel mare her father had broken 3 summers before, and she loaded the pack behind the cantle, and she led the mare out into the yard while the sun was still an hour above the western ridges, and she did not look back at the cabin, because looking back was the sort of thing that made a person sit down in the road. She rode north along the creek until the wagon track thinned to a cow path, and she rode the cow path until it thinned to nothing at all, and then she rode by the shape of the land itself, keeping the water on her left and the low sun on her back. The first night she camped in a stand of cottonwoods, where the creek made a slow bend, and she did not build a fire, because she did not yet know how far behind her the sheriff's interest reached, and she sat with her back against the sorrel's saddle, and ate cold cornmeal mixed with creek water, and listened to the mare crop grass in the dark. The wind came down off the higher ground, with the smell of pine and cold stone in it, and she pulled the 2 blankets around her shoulders and slept in pieces, waking once to the yip of a coyote, and once to the mare shifting her weight, and once to nothing at all except the great silence of country that had no houses in it. In the morning she rose before light and rode on. The valley narrowed as she climbed. The bottom grass gave way to sage, and then to bunch grass, and then to the first scattered pines, and the creek she had been following forked twice, and each time she took the western fork, because the western fork was the one Ruth Ainsley had taken all those years ago. By the second afternoon, the country had changed entirely around her. The air was thinner and colder, and it made her chest ache when she breathed deeply, and the ridges rose steep on either side, with bands of pale rock showing through the timber, and the sorrel's breath came in visible plumes, even in the middle of the day. She rested the mare often. She got down and walked beside her on the steepest pitches, and she checked the cinch and the pack lashings at every stop, because a saddle that slipped in this country could kill a person by inches over the course of a week. On the 3rd morning she found the switchback trail. It was not a trail anyone would have recognized without knowing where to look. only a faint braid of game paths crossing a shale slide at a particular angle. But she knew it, because Ruth Ainsley had made her walk it twice, up and down, saying, "Learn the shape of the ground, girl. Ground is the only thing that will not lie to you." She led the mare up the switchbacks on foot, one careful step and then the next, and where the shale was loose, she kicked it aside with the toe of her boot, and where a pine had fallen across the path, she unpacked the hatchet and cut a way through, and by the time she reached the top of the last pitch, the sun was overhead, and the sorrel was blowing hard, and Mary Ward's legs were shaking under her from the climb. She stood at the edge of the hidden bench of meadow, and she looked across it, and she saw the fallen cabin at the far side, just where Ruth had said it would be, its ridgepole sagging, and its door hung on one hinge, and its chimney standing straight as a soldier, against the pines behind. And she put her hand on the tin box in her pocket, and she started walking toward it across the tall grass. The grass came up to her waist in places, dry now in the late September light, and going the color of old brass at the tips, and it whispered against her coat as she walked, and against the sorrel's shoulders behind her. The cabin sat on a slight rise at the meadow's northern edge, where the timber began to close in, and the closer she came to it, the more clearly she could see what time and weather had done. The ridgepole sagged in the middle, where a heavy snow year had pressed it, but the log walls beneath were still square to the ground, and the corner notches were still tight, cut in a full dovetail by a hand that had known the work. She counted the courses of logs as she came up on it. 7 high on the long walls, 8 on the gable ends, each log about a foot through, and peeled clean of bark before setting. The wood weathered to the pale silver of driftwood, but sound when she thumbed her nail against it. The cabin measured maybe 16 feet by 20, one room, with a low doorway on the south side and a single square window opening on the east wall, that had once been closed with an oiled hide and was now open to the wind. The door itself hung from its upper strap hinge, the lower hinge broken away, and the wood around it splintered, and when she pushed it aside, it swung with a slow scrape. Inside, the light came through the sagged ridge and the empty window, and lay in bright slats across the floor. She stood in the doorway a long moment and let her eyes take the room. The floor was of split puncheon, wide planks laid flat side up, mostly whole, though warped and cupped, where rain had come in over the years. A pole bunk was framed into the north wall, the rope webbing rotted away, but the frame still fast to the logs. A shelf ran the length of the west wall, held up by pegs driven into the wood, and on it sat a tin plate, a cracked earthenware cup, and a small iron pot with its bail gone. The chimney at the west end was what she looked at longest, because the chimney was what she had come for, in a way she could not yet name. It was fieldstone laid up in lime mortar, the stones fitted with the same care as the corner notches of the walls, 5 feet across at the base, and rising in a straight taper through the roof. The hearth in front of it was a single flat slab of pale sandstone, about 3 feet by 4, worn smooth by long use in the center, and darkened at the edges by soot. When she knelt and put her hand flat on it, the stone was cold, and beneath the cold there was the faint smell of old wood smoke that never entirely leaves a hearth once it has been laid. She spent the rest of that afternoon making the place hold her. She unloaded the sorrel and hobbled her in the meadow grass. She swept the floor with a bundle of tied juniper. She stretched a piece of canvas she had cut from the pack tarp across the worst of the sag in the roof. She cut a green pole and propped the ridge from beneath. She hung her second blanket over the doorway against the coming night. And when the light in the meadow had gone from brass to rose, and then to a thin blue, she sat down on the hearth slab, with her back against the cold stone of the chimney, and ate cornmeal from the tin cup, and listened to the mare crop grass in the dusk outside. She slept that first night on the puncheon floor beside the hearth, and she woke before it was light, with the certainty that the stone under her hip was not sitting flush. She had felt it in her sleep, a hollow give when she shifted, the sound a floor makes when there is air beneath it. She waited for the window to gray, and when it did, she got up and went to her pack, and she came back with the hatchet and the skinning knife, and she knelt at the edge of the hearth slab. She worked the knife blade along the joint between the sandstone and the puncheon, and small pieces of dried mortar and old ash came away. And she worked the knife around the whole perimeter of the slab until she could feel it lift free at its edges. Then she put the hatchet head under the corner and pried, gently, patient the way Elgin Ward had taught her to pry a shoe from a horse without splitting the hoof, and the slab tilted up an inch, and then two, and then she got her fingers under it and lifted it aside onto the floor. Beneath the slab was a shallow pit lined with flat stones, about 2 hands deep and 2 hands wide, and set down in the pit was a small wooden box wrapped in a piece of oiled deerskin gone stiff and dark with the years. Mary sat back on her heels and looked at it for a long moment before she reached for it. She lifted it out with both hands. The box was pine, dovetailed at the corners, the way the cabin logs were notched, about the size of a family Bible, and when she cut the leather thong that bound the deerskin and folded the skin back, the box beneath was clean and dry. She opened the lid. Inside, in a small canvas pouch tied at the neck, were 42 gold pieces, $5 coins and $10 coins mixed, along with a thick fold of paper money, bound with a strip of hide, and stacked beneath the pouch were 3 items laid flat: a worn leather trapping journal, a woman's silver thimble black with tarnish, and a folded letter sealed with a smear of pine pitch. Mary broke the pitch with her thumbnail. The letter was written in a careful, forward-slanting hand, in pencil that had faded but was still clear, on 4 sheets of ledger paper folded in quarters. "Whoever finds this," it began, "my name is Alma Deering, and I have lived in this cabin 22 years. My husband Ned built it the summer after we came up out of the valley, in the bad winter of the fever, when we lost our girl Sarah, who was 7 years old, and I could not bear the sight of the house where she had died. Ned trapped these draws for 14 years, and I midwifed for the scattered families up and down the West Forks, and when Ned went through the ice on the beaver pond in his 16th winter, I stayed on alone another 8 years, because the ground had taken enough from me, and I would not let it take the cabin too. I am old now, and my hands are going, and I am walking down to my sister in Colorado this month, while I still can. I am leaving what I saved for whoever comes next. It is $460 in gold and paper, honest money from furs and from babies caught, and it is meant for a person who needs it. If you are reading this, you are that person. Do not thank me. Use it. There is good water in the spring, behind the north wall, and the meadow will run 20 head if you fence the shale slide. The thimble was my Sarah's. She never got to be a woman, but I hope you do. Alma Deering." Mary folded the letter along its old creases and put it back inside the pine box beside the pouch of gold and the tarnished thimble, and she sat for a long time on the puncheon floor, with her hands flat on her knees, listening to the meadow wind move through the standing grass outside. Then she got up and set the hearth slab back into place, tapping it down with the heel of her palm, and she went out into the light to begin work. She began with the roof, because a sagging ridge would kill the cabin before winter. She walked the timber behind the north wall until she found a straight lodgepole pine about 8 inches through and 30 feet long, and she felled it with the hatchet in 2 afternoons of patient cutting, resting her arm often. She limbed the pole, dragged it down with the sorrel mare, in a rope harness Ruth Ainsley had once shown her how to knot, and she wedged it up under the old ridge with a pair of vertical props cut from smaller pines. The old ridge stopped groaning. She patched the shakes where the snow had opened them, splitting new ones from a length of fur, with a froe she made from the skinning knife bound to a green handle, and she nailed them with cut nails pulled from the broken lower hinge and straightened on the hearthstone. On the 9th day, while she was chinking the west wall with a paste of clay from the spring bank, mixed with dry grass, a man rode up out of the timber on a shaggy dun horse and stopped at the edge of the meadow. He was in his 60s, small and dry as a stick, with a fur cap and a rifle across his knees, and he watched her work for a long minute before he spoke. His name was Josiah Meek, and he had trapped the West Forks for 31 years, and he had known Alma Deering and had helped bury Ned when they cut him out of the ice. He asked Mary who she was to the cabin. She told him. He looked at her hands and at the mended ridge and at the sorrel grazing in the grass, and he got down off the dun and helped her chink the rest of the west wall before dark. He came back 4 days later with a bale for the iron pot, a coil of good hemp rope, and a bag of dried venison, and he stayed a week helping her dig out the spring behind the north wall and lay a stone box around the seep so the water ran clear into a pool the size of a wash basin. A week after Josiah Meek first came, a woman named Hetty Pardee walked into the meadow from the south, leading a pack burro loaded with a sack of seed potatoes, a paper of onion sets, and a hen in a slatted crate. Hetty Pardee was 34 and lived 6 miles down the West Fork with her husband and 2 sons, and Alma Deering had caught both her boys. She had heard from Josiah Meek that someone was in the old cabin. She stayed the afternoon, helped Mary turn a patch of meadow sod with a borrowed spade, and left the hen. She said the hen's name was Pearl, and that Pearl would lay through the cold if kept warm and talked to. By the middle of October, a young rancher named Wesley Hollister and his wife Anna Hollister came up the switchback trail with 4 yearling heifers and a bred cow, driving them slow through the shale. Wesley Hollister was 28, and Anna Hollister was 26, and they ran a small outfit 2 ridges east, and had lost a barn to a spring flood the year before, and they knew what it was to start with almost nothing. They would not take Mary's coin. They said the heifers were on shares, half the calves back to them for 3 years, and Mary and Wesley Hollister shook on it, standing in the meadow grass. Wesley Hollister spent 2 days helping Mary fence the shale slide with cut pine and rawhide lashings, the way Josiah Meek had shown her, and Anna Hollister spent those same 2 days inside the cabin, scrubbing the shelf and the puncheon with lye and sand until the wood came up pale. By the first snow, the cabin had a tight roof, a chinked wall on every side, a clean-swept hearth, a door hung on 2 new leather strap hinges, an oiled hide across the window, and a second one folded ready for the cold, a rope-webbed bunk on the north wall, strung with new manila, 5 head of cattle grazing the fenced meadow, a laying hen roosting in a box beside the stove, and a spring house of piled stone behind the north wall, where a crock of milk from the bred cow stayed cold, and running water. Mary Ward slept warm every night, with the 2 wool blankets, and a third traded from Anna Hollister for a day's mending, and the tin sewing box sat on the shelf above the hearth beside the pine box, and inside the pine box the folded letter and the tarnished thimble sat undisturbed, and the 42 gold pieces and the folded paper money sat mostly untouched, because Mary Ward had learned young from Elgin Ward not to spend a saved dollar until a saved dollar was needed. She spent the first winter learning the ground. She snowshoed the timber behind the cabin, on webs Josiah Meek made her, from bent willow and rawhide, and she set a light trap line along the draws for marten and fox, and she skinned and stretched the pelts on the west wall of the cabin, the way her father had once stretched a beaver hide on the barn. In February, Anna Hollister's second boy came early in a hard wind, and Wesley Hollister rode up the switchback trail in the dark, and found Mary awake at the hearth, and Mary rode down behind him through breaking snow with Alma Deering's midwife satchel from under the bunk, and she caught the child at dawn with hands that shook only a little, and she named nothing, but did what she had watched Ruth Ainsley do a dozen times as a girl. After that, the families up and down the West Forks knew her name. They called her Mary Ward of the High Meadow, or sometimes only Mary of the Bench, and they came up the switchback trail one or two at a time through the spring and summer with small business, a wagon spring to be mended, a mare to be looked at, a girl about to be married who wanted a wool coat lined, a boy with a cut hand, a widow with a lamb that would not nurse. Mary took what they brought in trade, a sack of flour, a jar of honey, a bolt of muslin, a young sow, a used plow point, a set of window glass wrapped in straw, and she gave back the specific competence Elgin Ward and Ruth Ainsley and Alma Deering had left in her hands. A small ritual formed without anyone naming it. On the last Sunday of each month, whoever was coming up the trail came that day, and Mary set a pot of beans on the hearth in the morning and a kettle beside it. And by noon, there were 4 or 5 horses hobbled in the meadow, and a low bench of split pine outside the door, with people sitting on it, eating from tin plates. Josiah Meek came when the weather allowed. Hetty Pardee came with her boys. Wesley and Anna Hollister came with the baby in a sling. They spoke of weather and calves, and the price of hides in the valley towns, and nobody spoke of Dry Creek or of Sheriff Ephraim Boone, whose reach did not climb the switchback trail, and whose paper had no meaning on the bench. In the second spring on the bench, when the snow had gone off the meadow, and the grass was coming up green along the seep, Mary Ward sat on the split pine bench outside the cabin door in the last hour of a long afternoon, and looked across the ground she had come to know. The sorrel mare was grazing at the far edge of the meadow, with the bred cow and the 4 yearling heifers, now grown to 5 head, with the calf Anna Hollister had helped pull in April, and Pearl, the laying hen, was walking the yard, in slow lines pecking at whatever the wet ground turned up. The cabin behind her had a straight ridge again, a tight roof of split-fir shakes, chinked walls the color of pale clay, a door that swung true on 2 leather hinges she had cut and greased herself, and a hearthstone that lay flush against the puncheon so that a person walking across it would never guess what had once been under it. She sat with her hands on her knees, the way Elgin Ward had sat on the porch of the homestead in the valley in the last summer of his life, and she thought about the people who had put her here without meaning to. On the shelf above the hearth, inside the cabin, the tin sewing box sat beside the pine box, the 2 of them close enough that the copper wire on the enamel hinge nearly touched the dovetailed corner of the pine. Mary had put them side by side on purpose. The tin box had come to her from Ruth Ainsley, who had walked her up the switchback trail when she was 14 and made her remember it, who had taught her the names of plants and the ways hurt animals moved, and how to knot a rope harness so a horse could drag a log without cutting itself, and who had died in her sleep one winter and left a girl a needle case and a folding pair of scissors and a pressed sprig of yarrow. The pine box had come to her from Alma Deering, who had lived on the bench 22 years and buried a husband under the ice of the beaver pond and a daughter in the valley below, and had folded 4 sheets of ledger paper in quarters and sealed them with pine pitch for whoever came next. Neither woman had known Mary as a grown woman. Both of them had loved somebody they had not gotten to see finish growing. Both of them had left their careful competence behind in a small container with a hinge, and both of those containers now sat on the same pine shelf above the same hearth, and Mary Ward was the person they had left them for, though neither had known her name. She thought of Sheriff Ephraim Boone only briefly. The way one thinks of weather in a season one is no longer standing in. She thought of the boot print he had left in the soft mud of her father's step, and of the appraisal signed by a man who had never walked the bottom land along the creek, and of the 2 unnamed men on horseback who had not dismounted. Word had come up the trail through the winter that the homestead had been sold at the courthouse steps for less than the feed notes, and that Sheriff Boone had bought it himself, through a cousin. Mary had received the news the way she received news of a distant storm. The bottom land along Dry Creek was gone. What she stood on now was 160 acres of bench meadow that no county map showed, watered by a spring behind a north wall, fenced against the shale slide with cut pine and rawhide lashings, held by no paper at all except a folded letter in a pine box. She stood after a while and walked out into the meadow to bring in the mare. The evening light went from brass to rose to thin blue the way it had gone on her first night in the cabin, and she thought that the best measure of a place was whether the same light kept faith with you across the seasons. Mary Ward was 22 years old and homeless on the last week of September when Sheriff Ephraim Boone put a boot print on her step. She had $11.40 to her name and a tin sewing box in her coat pocket, and she carried them into the high country above the valley and spent them on a switchback trail and a fallen cabin at the end of it. It was the best $11.40 she ever carried, and the best trail she ever walked, and the best hearthstone she ever lifted. And the ground she stood on now was hers. In every way ground can be held by a person, by work, by knowledge, by the hands of the dead who had prepared it, and by the quiet consent of the living who came up the trail on the last Sunday of every month to eat beans from tin plates outside her door. If this story sat with you, the way Mary Ward sat with her hands on her knees in the last hour of a long afternoon, take a moment before you go and tap the subscribe button and leave a small word in the comments, because these stories reach the people who need them only when the ones who love them pass them along. Tell us where you're watching from tonight, and tell us the name of the person in your own life who saw what you were capable of before anybody else did. The older woman on the next place over, the widowed uncle, the school teacher who kept you after class, the neighbor who taught you to shoe a horse, or read a ledger, or walk a trail twice so you would remember it. Every one of us has a Ruth Ainsley somewhere in our past, and every one of us, if we are lucky and patient, will find an Alma Deering waiting under a hearthstone we did not expect to lift. And here is the question we want to leave you with tonight, to carry into your week, and to turn over in your own hands, the way Mary turned the folded letter over in hers. What did you lose that you thought was the end of you? And what did you find later, on ground nobody thought worth taking, that turned out to be the beginning? Sit with that question a while. Say the answer out loud if you can, to somebody who will listen, and then come back and tell us in the comments, because the meadow on the bench is wide enough for all of us, and there is always another pot of beans on the hearth, and another place on the split pine bench outside the door.